Welcome to today's Global Connections program. I'm Bill Miller. What are the various types of disabilities that affect basically 1 out of every 7 people on the planet? What can be done to provide some assistance to these folks to help them to overcome these problems and to improve their quality of life? We'll be back in just a moment to talk about these and other important issues. Welcome back to our program. It's been estimated that 1 out of every 7 people on planet Earth has some form of disability. Today we're going to shine the spotlight on the various types of disabilities and see what can be done to provide assistance. My guest today is someone who's very involved in this area. My guest today is Dr. Valerie Karr. Dr. Valerie Karr is an expert in the field of child education and public awareness strategies. Dr. Karr is an author and consultant, and she currently works as an adjunct professor at the University of New Hampshire. She is also the co-author of a new book called Crisis, Conflict, and Disability, Ensuring Equality. Dr. Valerie Karr, welcome to today's Global Connections program.
Thank you for having me.
I appreciate you being with me. Let's jump right into this. We talk about disabilities. There's a wide range of disabilities. Are we talking about sensory disabilities? We're talking about intellectual, physical? What types of disabilities, how do you define them?
Sure. We're talking about everything. So we're talking about all types of disabilities, and we used to define them by medical terms, so you'd get a diagnosis by a doctor, and everyone would really look at it from the perspective of a medical position. Now we've transitioned, since the passage of the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, to a social model of disability, which is a person's impairments in interaction with barriers that they may encounter in society. So it takes that onus off of the person themselves as something that's wrong or a defect, and really pushes the burden back onto society to be more inclusive and accessible.
So that broadens it out.
It broadens it out.
Certainly
yes,
does, right? You mentioned the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. This reminds me, the United Nations has been involved in this area of disabilities for many, many years. There are international agreements, and the Convention on the Rights of the Persons with Disabilities seems to be sort of the foundation, I think, of a lot of the discussion and international activities on this. What exactly is that convention? Very briefly. I know we could spend the whole show on that.
Yeah, we can. The Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities is the highest form of international law, so it's the highest thing the UN can do to say that the rights and fundamental freedoms of persons with disabilities should be respected and promoted. It's a specific convention on disability because people with disabilities are much more likely to be discriminated against around the world. But what's interesting about the convention at the UN is that it has had the quickest ratification and implementation of any convention at the UN. So it shows this global movement in support of people with disabilities and their rights, that the international community is really ready to move forward on ensuring the rights of people.
And as I recall, the Americans for Disabilities Act was back in 1990 or something like that.
1990.
That was sort of the basis for the creation of this Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, was it not? A lot of that language was brought into it, a lot of the terminology and that type of thing?
Right, so for generations, the U.S. has really been a leader in disability, especially the Americans with Disabilities Act. And the convention, a lot of the text of the convention, a lot of the ethos of the convention are based on the Americans with Disabilities Act. So that's respect for the rights of persons with disabilities, but also includes reasonable accommodation.
Exactly. Now in 2013, let's see, well, first off, how many countries have signed on? Do we have, that may have changed, but
it changes
ballpark
daily.
figure roughly?
It depends if you signed, which means you agree in principle, or if you ratified, which means you adopt into law. So there's over 150 that have signed.
But now the U.S. is one that has not.
We have signed, which means we agree. So in 2009, President Obama signed the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. So it means you won't do anything to directly violate it. But again, since the convention is so in line with U.S. principles and laws, that's not necessarily a large task to do. To ratify, it went to Senate in 2012. But unfortunately, it didn't pass by 5 votes, which was very difficult for the disability community. There's a lot of false claims around the convention at the time of the vote for the Senate hearings. people falsely claimed that it would change parent rights, that you would lose rights to your kids, you wouldn't be able to make educational decisions, but those were false. So we're back at the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. There's been 2 hearings in 2013, and we're hoping to get it back to the Senate for full ratification in 2014.
Now, you're also involved in a group called World Enabled,
Yes.
and the website is www.worldenabled.org. What exactly is World Enabled? What does it do, and what are some of its major programs?
Great. World Enabled was formed in response to the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. So as human rights advocates, we were looking at young people with disabilities and realizing it's a large part of the population and that they have a unique perspective. So World Enabled is there to educate, inspire, and lead, and show the world really that people with disabilities are capable, they have capabilities, and they can create change and do good. So it's about that positive model about disability, working with youth and young people around the world on education programs, so human rights education. We've done a book with UNICEF. I authored a book with UNICEF on the rights of children with disabilities, but also using that to say, what can I do as a young person in my own country to promote my rights? And what should I identify as a person with a disability that is a priority for me? So it really puts that power in the hands of young people with disabilities to change their future.
Mm-hmm. Now, you mentioned UNICEF, the United Nations Children's Fund, and you keep referencing rights. And this is really excellent, because probably not too many years ago we didn't associate rights with people who had disabilities, I would imagine. I mean, I haven't followed the philosophy all these years, but as we talk about this, and you mentioned UNICEF, it reminds me too of, when we talk about rights, I think the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that was drafted by the United Nations General Assembly in 1948. And in fact, Eleanor Roosevelt helped shepherd that through the General Assembly. That has sort of been the Bill of Rights Constitution for a large number of countries around the world. And of course, we have a Constitution, a Bill of Rights in the United States. But do you tie this into, like the Bill of Rights in the United States and the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights, when you're talking about people with disabilities and the rights that they have or should have in a particular country X or country Y?
Well, those should cover people with disabilities, right? So the Universal Declaration of Human Rights means the only way you get in on that is if you're human, right? So
automatically.
Right, exactly. Human rights are about all human beings.
That's right.
But unfortunately what's happened is we've seen vulnerable populations or populations at risk to discrimination who are particularly marginalized. And that includes people with disabilities, but it also includes children. It included women at sometimes. And the UN has had to develop special conventions. So we have a convention for women. We have a convention for children. And now we have one for disability. A new one's coming about. We have one for migrant workers. And so the Universal Declaration was supposed to cover all humans, but by nature of neglect, I guess, that we haven't really been paying attention or respecting the rights of people with disabilities, that they need a special convention that will talk about them in particular to raise awareness of governments to refine their national legislation. But also there's extra things in the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. I talked about reasonable accommodation a minute ago. And that means that businesses and communities should make for example, physical accessibility, ramps in a building. And so reasonably it's expected that all public buildings should have ramps and systems to allow people in wheelchairs to go in. And that would be a reasonable accommodation. So it's a little bit extra that's in the UN Convention. Literature, information in schools in Braille, so people who are blind could read them. So it allows that extra things that people can access knowledge, access physical buildings. And that's in special consideration in articles within our convention.
And earlier you were referencing, we were talking about the vote in the United States Senate and how it failed by 5 votes, but it'll be brought up again in all probability. Especially, it's so important because this was really not a carbon copy, but a lot of the language in the United States legislation was adopted by the United Nations, and they agreed to this, and a large number of countries have signed on. But as I recall, I remember that debate, and there were a lot of myths out there about how this would undermine people who were homeschooling their children, that children would have more rights than the parents. Those were myths. How do you deal with those myths?
It's hard to educate. You know, I think when someone has a mouthpiece with the media and with the public, they can say things that are wrong, and no one's there to refute it. So it's really about the disability community being able to bring the facts back out, and we're caught unaware. You know, the disability community really thought, because it passed internationally so easily, that with the Senate we had the votes and it was going to move forward, and then all of a sudden, right before all of that negative media attention, those false claims came about and really scared a few votes out for us. So it's really about us becoming more informed, bringing the voice back, saying that it does not change parental rights. Secretary of State Kerry said it, you know, this convention is not about changing America. It's about America leading the way to change the rights for everyone around the world. And, you know, it's that moral leadership of the United States. It's the fact that if we're on board with the convention in other countries, it makes it easier for disabled Americans to travel abroad, because other countries will be more accessible. You know, the Chamber of Commerce says it'll be good for our industry with the need for accessible technologies and information. And they even did a poll with regular Americans saying that Americans are saying we need to sign these UN conventions, that we as a population do support this. So we just need to see it through Senate.
Exactly. Now, your recent book, Crisis, Conflict, and Disability, Ensuring Equality,
Yes.
What exactly was the theme of that book? What message were you trying to get out?
So it really originates from a forum that I do in Doha, Qatar, which is on the same topic. And we come together with world leaders, NGOs, and the disability community to talk about current issues related to the convention, but that are largely neglected. So these things that may not be attended to immediately. And one of the things is crisis and conflict. It's ever increasing in our world. We've had many, many natural disasters recently, and what we've seen is that people with disabilities in situations of risk, in disaster and conflict, they're largely ignored. They're neglected, they're left behind. So people with disabilities are more likely to die in a situation of risk. They're last to receive medical care and equipment, and they're last in line. So, you know, as an international community, we want to come together to say, how can we be more inclusive? And this book is an edited book. Authors around the world that take a look at different situations of risk, different conflict and crisis, and say, how do aid organizations, how do governments, how do we plan inclusively to make sure that this doesn't happen again?
Well, you're watching Global Connections Television, which is an independently produced program. The opinions expressed on Global Connections are solely those of the moderator and his guests. Today we're taking a look at this broad topic of disabilities, and my guest is an expert in this area. My guest today is Dr. Valerie Karr, and Dr. Valerie Karr has been working in the field of child education and public awareness strategies. She recently had a new book that was published called Crisis, Conflict, and Disability, Ensuring Equality. We're talking about your book, and we're talking about a situation that living just under normal circumstances can be very difficult if you have certain disabilities, obviously. But if you're in a crisis area, or we see that various natural disasters have occurred. We see wars, civil wars raging like in Syria and that type of thing. What can be done to work with governments, either through the United Nations, through other groups that you've been involved with and what have you, to help people with disabilities to prepare for some type of natural disaster or some type of conflict in their country? Not that we can always determine beforehand you're going to have an earthquake or a typhoon that would go through the Philippines, or Katrina, Hurricane Katrina, but what can be done to help them better prepare?
So the first is to acknowledge the importance of planning for someone with disabilities, and it is about preparedness. We like to think that it's about the response and recovery a lot of the times, but if people with disabilities aren't prepared and planned for before, then they're largely neglected during a disaster. So, for example, in 2004 in the tsunami in Japan, in the earthquake, people with disabilities were twice as likely to die. In Katrina, the ones who didn't get evacuated were the elderly, the poor, and the disabled. And that really showed us that in America, as well as around the world, we're not prepared to evacuate people with disabilities. Another example is in Katrina, we had a home for people with disabilities that was evacuated on a bus. They had to go to 3 different shelters and facilities before someone would accept them. The shelters didn't want to accept the risks that people were medically fragile and they might have more needs than they could provide for. So for 24 hours, these people are on a bus trying to get out, and they're getting sick by the nature of the fact that they can't find a place to go. So after Katrina, after these disasters, we really needed to do something differently. So for example, in the US, in FEMA, after 2009, they appointed a whole disability division, but their responsibility was not to provide a separate disability division. It was to go out and meet all the communities, all the people with disabilities, to create action plans, to hear the voice of those with disabilities, to educate them, but also to educate the local community on how to seek out people with disabilities for evacuation, how to create shelters that were accessible. For example, someone who's blind was rejected from a shelter because they had a seeing eye dog. And FEMA has a policy that says you're allowed in with a seeing eye dog. That's under the ADA, Americans with Disabilities Act. And now we do two things. One, we're raising awareness with the shelter. We're saying that this is a right that someone has to bring in, right? That's an accommodation they deserve. But we're also talking to the person who has the guide dog. And we said, if you're in a situation of a disaster, you have your stuff ready to go, you also bring that policy with you that says not only no matter who I encounter at this shelter, I could say these are my rights and I'm allowed in. So it goes hand in hand with the community. You have an informed group of people with disabilities that know their rights, but you also have a community that's welcome and thoughtful and understanding about disability.
Do you think there's been a rise as far as awareness, the level of awareness by people both in the United States and around the world to focus attention on people with disabilities and not just discard them, because so many years ago you'd hear about they were just ignored, they were shunned, they provided few services to them, they couldn't care less what happened to them. But do you think that is changing today? I know every country is different to some degree, and within a country it's different to some degree, but it seems like that there's more of an awareness that's out there that's taking place. Is that correct or not?
I think so. I think it's our time in the disability community. There's the UN Convention, which provides tremendous momentum. These countries that have signed it, they have to do change. They have to create change. Part of that, too, is there's an article on awareness raising. So in addition to changing your laws and being more accessible, you have to raise awareness about the capabilities and the contributions that people with disabilities can make to society. So it's no longer a group of people you could say, oh, we can ignore them, we can get away with it. But it also says that, the World Bank, Jim Wolfenson said that if we don't address disability, we're never going to address poverty, world poverty, because it's such a significant part of our population. So people now and governments now are looking at people with disabilities, say they can be economic contributors. So if you have an education, if you have the right to education, if you have the right to a job, you contribute to society. You're not a drag on society. And yes, maybe it takes accessibility, maybe it takes accommodation, maybe it takes protections and laws. But once you have that, you have a bonus, you have an add-on value to your community. And I think people are really starting to realize that.
Now, December 3rd every year was declared by the United Nations General Assembly the International Year of the Disabled Person. 1981 was the International Year of the Disabled. Secretary General Ban Ki-moon appointed Stevie Wonder as one of his messengers of peace. And of course, Stevie Wonder is visually impaired. There are various things that the UN is doing. How important is that to shine that spotlight on this particular issue and to not only focus on it in the United States, but really worldwide, to bring everybody into the discussion?
Well, it's about awareness. It's about sensitivity. It's about making change. A lot of it led up to the fact that we needed a convention, and we had to justify that. So some of the stuff that happened before early 2000 was about building that momentum, saying there's a need here. So we're going to highlight that need. We're going to highlight the discrimination. But other parts of that, like Stevie Wonder and blindness, it's about the fact that he's, a world-class artist, and he happens to have a disability, and about that contribution. And in many countries around the world, that's just not seen. Children with disabilities are hid in the home. Parents are still ashamed. They think it's something that they did. They think it might be a curse from God. And the more you get out there and you see people with disabilities in your community, or you see them on television, you see them getting awards, you see the Secretary General talking about it, you realize that there is no myth. That myth doesn't exist. You don't need to be ashamed of your child, your sibling, your parent, that it's part of what happens in life. And I have two examples of this. One is in Japan, for kids with autism, especially in Tokyo, that parents really did hide autism, and they were very shamed that it existed in their family. And Yoko Ono is the UN Global Ambassador for Autism, not UN, but she's a Global Ambassador for Autism. She went over there and spoke at one of their conferences, and that was aired on TV. And the shift in public opinion about autism, then you had a leader, right? An artist, someone they admire, who's coming out and saying, it's okay, we value this population, they're important to us, really created a shift in attention, and parents felt a lot better about being able to seek out services. Whereas before, these children were in the home. No one knew about them. And now parents are going, my child has autism, and that's okay. Now what can I do about that? What can I get for them? The other positive change we've seen out of natural disaster again was in Haiti during the earthquake. People with disabilities were hid in the house. There's situations where someone goes, I saw my neighbor bringing someone else out of their house and I didn't know that that person lived next door to me, because it was so hidden, especially because in Haiti the religious beliefs say that it is a sin. It's a reaction. It's something you've done in the family to deserve disability. But after the earthquake, so many people were disabled by the earthquake itself, and the rehabilitation centers were developed. Teachers now are returning to work, being amputees or having disabilities themselves. People with disabilities could be seen in the public for the first time, and it allowed people who'd been born or disabled prior to the earthquake to come out and be part of society. So it's a unique shift there, just how we raise awareness, how it comes about, but there's more opportunities than ever for people to be out in the community.
You mentioned autism, and of course we talk about autism as a major problem, or a disability that's finally starting to see the light of day. And I remember not too many years ago, I was at the UN one day when it was World Autism Day, I guess it was. Lots of activities going on up here, major speakers and what have you, and the media covered it to some degree, but so often during the whole discussion they never mentioned the United Nations one time. They might mention there was something was being held at the UN, but that was about the extent of it. But it's a real challenge to get that message out. And of course, if you have a messenger of peace like George Clooney or a Michael Douglas or Stevie Wonder or Dr. Jane Goodall, then that's going to bring the media in, and they will focus on the problem. But it is a challenge to get that word out, is it not?
Absolutely, which is why the day was passed. We really advocated the state of Qatar passed a resolution honoring World Autism Awareness Day, and that's the first step. It's like the disability resolutions. It's the first step. Yoko Ono did a whole art piece for us, and then she became the Autism Speaks Global Ambassador for Autism. So you get the significant figure. You get people talking about it. You get countries to support it. And again, the more you're out there, the more you're highlighting the issue, the more the government knows that they need to dedicate funding to it. They need to train people to work with these children, but also the more parents know. World Autism Awareness Day is about celebrating the diversity. It's about supporting the family, seeing the value of these children and adults and what they could contribute. So it puts a positive spin on it as well. It's not just a disease or a disorder that needs to be fixed. It's something that as a community we need to come together and to discuss.
That's autism. It seems as though we're reading much more about it now, and it seems so too that I don't know if this is because of reporting or if the definitions have expanded or what, or maybe you could answer this for me, but as I recall a few years ago, it seemed like and it primarily affects males, as I understand it, male children.
More common in males.
More common in males, but it was like 1 out of every 85 males had autism. Now it's like 1 out of 45. Is it that it's occurring more frequently amongst males, or is it just we're doing a better job reporting it, or we're broadening the definition, or we're doing all of the above?
I think it's a bit of all of the above. It is more common in males. It's not becoming more common in males. It's just that it's becoming more common in our population. So more males are diagnosed. I believe in the U.S. we're at 1 in 150 for boys. In Korea, I think the autism boys and girls is 1 in 38. So we're seeing a lot of a rise in incidence, and that's because first, there's more awareness. So if you know what autism is, you could go to your doctor. You could talk about your concerns. You can get a diagnosis. Before, when we weren't talking about it, people didn't know what it was. It fell under other criteria for disability. So there is awareness. There's more supports and services for children with autism, so parents are more likely to seek that. But there also is a rise in autism. It's bigger, it's larger than what we can account for by awareness, for sure. And we don't know what that is. We know there's a genetic component, but we also see evidence that it could be environmental as well. There's contributing factors there. And our viewers can go to worldenabled.org and learn much more information about what we're talking about. Well, Valerie, in the last minute or so less that we have, let me ask you, this is a very important issue. It's a very important area. It's a very emotional area. I'm sure you can think of dozens of memorable activities that will be with you the rest of your life. Is there one that comes to mind about that will always stay with you, of something, a difference perhaps you've made in someone's life or someone's made a difference in your life? You know, I think it's my work in Syria. We went to Syria working with, we brought 12 Americans with disabilities over, kids, to work with 15 kids in Damascus, Syria, with disabilities, and we talked about human rights. But we didn't just talk about it. We asked them to create something. We had Liquid Comics, a comic book creator, a real company, come in, and they got to design an entire comic book series about, not about disability, but about a comic book character that just happened to have disability in their life, and it raised awareness. When we unveiled that comic book in Syria, the Damascus Opera House brought 1,200 Syrian citizens to come see this unveiling. And one of our students, a Syrian girl with a disability, who at the beginning of this program had said she would not stand up for her rights, she didn't know how to talk about it, she was nervous. She spoke to 1,200 of her peers, her citizens, in a packed opera house, and she's the one who was kind of confident and bold, and she was up there, and she knew that it wasn't just about her confidence. She knew it was about speaking up for a cause, and she made a difference.
She certainly did.
Yeah.
That's remarkable. Well, Dr. Valerie Karr, educator, author, and an expert on disabilities. This is a very important topic, and it's one that we all need to learn much more about. And you certainly shared a lot of information with us today, and people can go to your website and learn a lot more about it. But I want to thank you so very much for a very interesting and a very informative program.
Appreciate it.
I'm Bill Miller. Thank you for joining us on today's Global Connections program.